Well, thank you everyone for coming out tonight. It's a more Zoom after a long day of Zoom from a long couple months of Zoom. So I appreciate the chance to have this conversation. So I'll talk for 15, 20 minutes, give us a brief background on zombies, and maybe we can have a conversation about where zombies are going to head after this event we've been having for 8 or 9 months as an idea. So if you don't know me, my name's Brandon Kempner. I used to be a professor of English, I guess sort of still am. I'm currently our Dean of Arts and Sciences over at Highlands University. Been here for 14, 15 years, and a lot of that past 5 or 10 years I've spent researching the phenomenon of zombies from a literary and artistic perspective. So I'm just going to give you a brief rundown, history, where zombies have been, where zombies are going. So I use a field called cultural studies in the field of English, where we tend to look at the full range of artistic products, not necessarily being stuck up on novels or poems or classic works of literature, but wanting to consider almost anything that has that narrative and creative element as a piece of art. So movies, television shows, video games, songs on the radio, all of those kinds of things fall in the domain of cultural studies. And we tend to look at those things to try and find out what hidden meanings exist. And the question we ask about zombies, why are zombies popular? In some ways, it's like the worst possible idea you could come up with, right? Dead corpses that come out of the ground, shamble around, and try and bite you. If you remember some of those early zombie movies like Night of the Living Dead, the zombies aren't very fast moving, aren't very threatening, cheap makeup, terrible effects. But how did this monster become so popular over the last 70 or 80 years? And what does that popularity tell us about American culture, American society, and what we're afraid of? So we almost look at that surface of popular culture and ask us that question. What do these popular things tell us about our hopes, fears, desires, dreams, anxieties? It's got to resonate with us if we want to go see zombie movies over and over again. Think of how many zombie movies there have been, how many TV shows, how many keep coming out. Zombies are particularly fascinating because they're one of our first 20th century monsters. They're a monster that has a specific invention date in the 20th century. A lot of our other monsters, like vampires, date back hundreds, thousands of years. Frankenstein maybe dates back 200 years to Mary Shelley and her writing that novel. They have origins that are in Europe, but zombies are 20th century. They're New World monsters. They originated in Haiti as an idea, got popular down there, and then imported to the United States. And then lastly, they're also a monster that comes to us through film, not through novels. So there's no classic zombie novel by Charles Dickens that introduces the zombie, or ghosts that go back, again, hundreds of years right there. So a very different origin point for the zombies. And I'm always fascinated that there's actually one guy who introduced the idea of the zombie to North America. So that's what we'll talk a little bit about the history, that you can go find the actual person who popularized zombies in the United States. And then there's another movie, Night of the Living Dead in 1968, which introduces all of our modern zombie rules. So in some ways, the idea of if you get bit by a zombie, you turn into a zombie, that idea is only, 50, 60 years old. It doesn't go back that far. So it's actually invented at a very specific point in time to sort of talk about certain fears. So where do zombies come from? Why did they get popular in the first place? So zombies are originated in Haiti. And so there were rumors in Haiti, a little island off of Florida that grew sugarcane, that there were these sort of witch doctors who would raise dead slaves back to life to continue working in the sugarcane fields after they die. So that's sort of where we think the idea of zombies came from. So from the very first, zombies are a metaphor, an allegory, whatever word you want to use, a symbol for people to express their anxieties about what they thought was going wrong in culture. In this case, Haitian culture. The Haitian people were so upset they were being oppressed. They invented this monster to sort of reflect those fears. And that's often how we talk about horror monsters in cultural studies. What anxiety, what did they symbolize? And the zombie is a very flexible symbol because it changes over time. So originally it's this idea of you die, you've lived a terrible life, you've had to work in the slave fields your whole life, but not even dead do you get a chance to rest. You're brought back to life as a mindless slave to keep working in the sugar field. Very difficult. So this one guy named William Seabrook, strange man. He was like a self-professed cannibal. He went to Africa and like decided to eat people to see what cannibalism was like. So he liked to tour the world and find weird stories. So he goes down to Haiti looking for stories. And he writes a book called The Magic Island. And he writes a 10-page section in a 200-page book called Dead Men Working in the Cane Fields. And that single article from his book, he publishes in the United States. It becomes very popular. And that's what introduces the idea of zombies to the North American audience. So that travel book gets adopted into a short story, which becomes a stage play, and then it becomes the movie White Zombie. So that 1930s classic film, Bela Lugosi plays the witch doctor who brings dead people back to life as zombies. He enchants a white woman who becomes a zombie. These original Haitian zombies, they don't bite people. They're kind of helpless slaves who work in the cane fields. They aren't really a threat except they're mindless, and it allows the witch doctor to control you. So that's the first phase of zombies, and that lasts till the 1960s. There's a series of zombie movies. They become fairly popular. There's a zombie drink to get you really drunk, like to show that you're mindless like the zombies. But a lot of us scholars see that original phase of the zombie being a metaphor. Those zombies are about economics, and they're about racial anxieties. They're about this economic anxiety that capitalism is so rigged that you can never get ahead and that your fate is to become a zombie from working too hard, that you lose that individuality. And there's also this fear that maybe the black workers in Haiti are going to have a kind of slave revolt and rise up and overthrow the white people that are controlling them. So zombies from the very start have been allegorical. Right? What they represent are sort of the fears American people are having at a specific moment in their history. So early on, 1930s, 1940s, it's about race, it's about the Great Depression, it's about economics. So that's the big takeaway you can think about zombies. Zombies reflect the anxieties of contemporary society. That's why we like horror movies, because they let us work through the things we're scared of. No one's really that scared of getting eaten by a zombie, but they are worried about society falling apart. They are worried about losing their family, or they're worried about never getting ahead in their job and their life never sort of going anywhere. And zombieism is a reflection of that as a concept. So those original zombies didn't get that popular. They were sort of B-movie characters, less popular than Dracula or Frankenstein. Sometimes you throw zombies in if you had nothing else to do in your movie. But zombies don't really take off until the 1960s. And a filmmaker, George Romero, makes a movie called Night of the Living Dead. And that comes out in 1968, a low-budget film. Not a lot of money went into it, but that has the first modern zombies of what we think of zombies today are. So those are creatures, human beings that have come back from the dead. They want to eat other human beings. That doesn't exist in the original zombie from Haiti. And these zombies, if they bite you, you turn into a zombie. And George Romero, that film's originally very popular. He makes another film, Dawn of the Dead, 10 years later, which becomes explosively popular. George Romero fails to copyright Night of the Living Dead. So therefore, anyone can make a sequel to Night of the Living Dead, and zombies sort of take off. So there's things like Zombies 2, an Italian film that's a bootleg sequel to Night of the Living Dead. There's the Return of the Living Dead that has the classic brains line where the zombie goes brains and tries to eat people. Zombies don't get copyrighted. Anyone can make their own zombie film. We get the modern world of the zombie as we know and love it today. So let's go back to Romero. So Romero's new zombie bites you, you become a zombie, you try and eat other people. What fears does that represent? What anxieties of the American people does that represent? Well, if this was a class, we'd spend like 4 weeks learning about that, but I'm just going to have to tell you. So we talk a lot about these thoughts that zombies in the 1960s and 70s begin to represent people's anxieties about conformity. Think about the whole sort of hippie thing that's going on. People are afraid that everyone in America is becoming too similar. So zombie is almost like a human being that's lost its will to think. The human body is still there, but the thinking part, the part that makes us unique or an individual, is gone. We're just reduced to our base desires to eat, to consume. So a lot of people see that as a fear of capitalism. This is sort of the fear of ultimately what we are. Aren't we all zombies? We have to go to Walmart every week to buy the same 6 products that we then take home and eat. And then we go to Walmart the next week and buy the same 6 products and come home, or we go to our jobs and shuffle around. So there's this fear in the 1960s, 1970s that people are losing whatever that spark is that makes us human. That we're becoming more and more copies of each other. The zombies, again, are humanity reduced to almost nothing. We're just sort of the shells of people. People use, the scholars in particular, use Dawn of the Dead as evidence of this, because most of Dawn of the Dead takes place in a shopping mall. And although people are still zombies, they still shuffle around trying to shop. It's like that's all they remember from their past life as human beings, is that I need to go to the mall. So that loss of autonomy, that loss of control, this fear of capitalism. There's also this fear of infection. And we're going to talk about that more in a second. But there's this tremendous sense that we don't have control of our own lives. And the flip side of the zombie movie is that there's always people who survive the zombie apocalypse and fight back against those zombies. And if you've watched some of the more recent works of zombie culture, let's say The Walking Dead TV show on AMC or the comic book, it's often about people surviving the zombie apocalypse and sort of getting away from all those fears we mentioned a moment ago. If you know The Walking Dead, the main character is Rick, kind of ex-cop. He's almost more successful after the zombies come than before, because he's able to sort of find new strength in himself to make a new kind of life. So the classic line we use in zombie studies is that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. That's sort of the world we live in, where we have to go to our jobs, the sort of strain of money. A zombie apocalypse takes all of that away. That there's no longer this need to make $17 an hour. It's just you and yourself trying to figure out what to do to survive from day to day. It radically transforms your life. And that's what people sort of maybe like about zombie films, is it allows us to think beyond the world we live in right now, to imagine a different kind of world, more terrifying than the world we live in, but perhaps more free. There's a lot of zombie movies where the people are almost happier after the zombies come than before. So all those ideas are sort of packed into zombie culture. It's become our most popular, or one of our most popular and powerful metaphors for thinking about how society might dramatically change. What would it be like to live if everything was totally different? To imagine some sort of world where capitalism has broken down, where it's just like raw survival. You have to fight to live. Is that more satisfying than the kind of lives we live now? So that brings us up to about 2020. And of course, everything has changed in the last 6 months. So that's where I sort of want to take our conversation, is in zombie studies, we're beginning to think about this idea, like, what are zombies going to be after COVID? Do we have new fears as an American people? Do we have new anxieties? How are our art forms going to change to reflect everything we've gone through in the last 6 months? So that's what I encourage us to think about. Maybe we can brainstorm some ideas, but how is literature and art going to change? Everyone has been through a very traumatic experience in the last 6 months. I mean, even if you didn't get COVID, our lives have been more disrupted in this 6-month period probably than any point since World War II or World War I in American society. And how are those emotional reactions we've been through, how are they going to be reflected in our art form? And are zombies going to play a key role in that? Because zombies are already about infection and disease and the fear of society breaking down and the kind of isolation zombie survivors go through. So I put down sort of my list of what I'm thinking about. Are zombies going to drop off in popularity for the next 10 years? That's a possibility. Is it too close to the bone? Are people going to be too worried about sort of a disease that we just don't want to see a zombie movie anymore? It's too painful to think about. I don't want to think about another infection spreading, because that's often what like zombies are representative as, a kind of plague or a disease that rapidly spreads through society, killing people. We've had new experiences of contagion in American society, people having to wear masks to protect themselves. We've had huge new experiences of isolation. Zombie movies are really about isolation a lot of the time. There's only a few people left, of being locked up, being by themselves. How about all those experiences we had at the beginning of COVID where we were all hoarding random stuff? I know I made some stupid purchases and bought a whole bunch of extra toilet paper and Cheez-Its and thinking like things were going to run out. But zombie movies are often about that kind of scavenging and collecting resources and supplies. Do we have a different perspective of that in October than we did in February? How about social and economic change? Zombies often symbolize rapid and total social change. Society falls apart in a lot of zombie movies. Well, do we want to watch movies where society falls apart? Are we afraid of society falling apart after COVID? Are we afraid of how sort of society is going to be reorganized after all of this happens and eventually a vaccine comes out? How are we going to process all these changes that we've gone through and done that? So I would offer the hypothesis that we're going to see a whole bunch of art about the fears and anxieties that COVID has produced, and that zombies may be one of our sources of working through emotionally what's happened in the last 6 months. Is that people, just like we had the zombies first come that were about Haiti and about slavery, and then we had zombies in the 1970s that were about economic conformity and society, we're probably going to get a new version of zombies out of 2020, that people are going to sort of use zombies to work through the anxieties, pains, and fears that have been produced by this pandemic. So that's basically sort of my framework of thinking about zombies and what I've been working on. So I'd love to open it up and have a conversation. Do we think zombies are going to still be popular, or are they going to fall off the map because they're just too painful to think about? No one's going to want to think about disease for the next 20 years or whatever it's going to be after COVID. How is COVID going to change the kind of horror literature and horror products we produce? What kind of movies are we going to get for next Halloween? Because horror is cheap to make, so it can actually go pretty quick. And I'm sure we'll get some COVID-themed movies almost right away once Hollywood gets back to working. So any initial ideas? You can just unmute yourself and talk. Eric, yeah, go ahead.
Doctor, thank you very much. I'm thinking at the same time that, not only, kind of framing that, zombie as metaphor or simulacra of anxieties and such, but I think besides the COVID pandemic, we're dealing with some polarized ideas around culture and communities. And for that matter, I think part of the metaphor of the zombie, particularly right now, is dealing with hordes of foreigners coming across the presentation. And of course, you're competing with a debate that's going on that I'm sure in the debate, there's going to make reference to Chinese pandemic carriers, et cetera, et cetera. So in the larger sense of saying, I think right now, part of that anxiety is not limited to the pandemic. But for the last 4 or 5 years, we'd had that alternative narrative, which is speaking about xenophobia and protectionism, nativisms, and to some degree how the zombie phenomena is reflective of that as well.
I think that's a great point, Eric. Zombies are often very raw because they're so violent, and they often represent the worst fears of the American people. And yes, there's been a lot of talk about the xenophobia. There's actually been a couple books published called Zombie Politics, sort of trying to use that metaphor to explain what's going on in American politics. Could it be any worse if zombies were running things? Or do we have the same sort of ideas coming back over and over again that don't do that? And Sam asked about the zombie drug. There was a bunch of research about that in the 1980s. And someone, in fact, put the theory forward that maybe it was a kind of pufferfish venom that some of these witch doctors were using in the 1930s to sort of put people in a hypnotic trance to make them easier to control. So I think there's that interesting idea. And what's great in that discussion is zombies can sort of be molded to almost anything. They're one of the more plastic ideas. They can be different fears, different anxieties, and they can change over time. I like what Peter put in the chat right here. Maybe we'll have more zombie humor. And that's one way to work through the anxiety of COVID, kind of gallows humor or dark humor of sort of, we can't sort of make sense of anything that's been going on the last 6 months, so might as well laugh at it. So maybe COVID zombies or something like that is an idea.
So I have a question, Brandon. You know, we've had tragic monsters, you know, the tragic Frankenstein, the tragic Dracula. Has anyone done a zombie from the perspective of the tragic zombie as an attempt to understand their experience and their pain and their prison of being in this, and as you put it so well, this kind of constant cycle of you know, forever just you know, just kind of being a zombie.
They have, and it's an interesting and somewhat weird genre. I can think of one big movie that came out a while ago. Sean put Fido in there, and that's a good example. There was Warm Bodies, which was Romeo and Juliet told with zombies. Where Juliet's a human girl and Romeo's a zombie. And sort of they fall in love and they have to cross those lines. And the girl helps bring the zombie R back to sort of his humanity as he's dealing with sort of being a zombie. There was a CW TV show called iZombie, which was from the point of view of a young woman who turns into a zombie. And if she eats people's brains, she relives their last memories of life. And she uses that to solve crimes. And they're all just really weird. So when you watch Warm Bodies, it's like distinctly uncomfortable because we have a love relationship between a zombie and a non-zombie that's going on. And it's much ickier than the sort of romantic vampire concept. Vampires are also undead, but not in quite the decaying concept that zombies are. But yeah, there are a lot of very interesting books told from the point of view of the zombie. And maybe that's what will happen with the zombie after COVID, is that we'll be like, since we all feel like zombies, since we're on Zoom so more, right? We can be zombies. And that'll be the metaphor that we can use, that we all feel like we're isolated, trapped, decaying, that maybe we'll want more stories from the zombies' point of view. That's one good possibility that might happen. Other ideas? Anyone feel like we won't want to watch horror movies for the next decade?
Maybe. But zombie movies, but you know, the thing about zombie movies is that they are sort of campy, right? And so they're not really, like they were talking about having Halloween movies that are not quite so scary. Like what could you watch that are not quite so scary in this Halloween season?
Yep.
They were talking about that on NPR. And I do think that zombie movies are sort of campy, that they're not, you know, that like a really, really scary movie is worse than a zombie movie.
Yeah, and one of my favorite semi-zombie movies is the Evil Dead series. And that's a great combination of humor with the undead right there. That in that sort of iteration of the zombie, by making the zombie ridiculous, you almost diffuse the anxieties that we're talking about. So combining horror and comedy can be a really powerful way of making those things we're scared of, like death, like infection, like COVID, not seen as serious, or that we can sort of overcome them. So yeah, if you have a zombie fall down or its head falls off and rolls down and the zombie has to pick it up and carry it around, that discontinuity that absurdity is a great way to handle things. So you might be onto something, Carol. Maybe that's what we'll get. A lot of those very absurd movies. Yeah, and Sean gave us one. Anna and the Apocalypse is like a zombie musical movie. So it's a pretty strange film where they have like big song and dance numbers, and for sometimes it's ridiculous, and then sometimes it's very serious. It's a very sort of whiplash-inducing movie that goes from all sorts of different emotional resonances. Yeah, Zombieland, another good example from Eric. It's amazing how many zombie films there are out there. That when you really get into it, just like half a dozen come out every year. There's a lot of television shows. There's just so much cultural investment in this idea of the zombie and how useful it is for us to think about things. Well, what do other people think? Renee, you were going to add something? Or?
Hey,
Sean,
Brent.
you want to jump in? Yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm just curious. I've never asked you, what sparked your interest in zombies?
Well, I've always been interested in horror and why horror is popular and why we deliberately put ourselves through traumatic experiences. It's a strange thing. Like, my dogs don't intentionally scare themselves. That's just not like a normal part of the animal experience that you would intentionally terrify yourself. But human beings like that. So I originally, through a lot of my initial scholarship, was looking at the literature of 9/11. So that happened while I was in graduate school, and we were studying a lot of sort of what kind of novels are written about 9/11. And then there were some zombie movies that came out right at the same time, 28 Days Later being the primary one. So that's sort of what got me interested in sort of how does America work through trauma through literature? How do we sort of as a culture create artistic products that are almost like therapy for ourselves? And that led into zombies, and then it's such a rich area with so many different things. And of course, how can you go wrong getting to watch movies and read science fiction and horror novels as part of your career? Well, other ideas? Do you think zombies are going to stick with us? Are they going to drop off in popularity?
That I had this vision when you were talking, because we're right before the election, that it would be like, with the debate tonight, that it would be like perfect to have kind of like a zombie debate, presidential debate, and that would be like the perfect Saturday Night Live kind of thing. So
what would be different than what we're going to have tonight, Carol? Right? So. And so that's always the joke, right? We already are living in the zombie apocalypse. So that's one of the great lines right? It's already that world, right? And things haven't really changed that much if there would be zombies, considering how often we have the same ideas, the same concepts, the same sort of mindless repetition of the past. Zombies aren't that much separated, perhaps, from the violence we already see in society around us. Some of the things Eric was talking about, the xenophobia we see in the United States does have a kind of almost zombie level violence attached to it. If you look at that border, and people have talked about a lot of the imagery of the zombie hordes is deliberately meant to evoke the imagery of immigrant hordes. And if you saw World War Z, which was very much about Palestine and Israel, in some of its concepts was explicitly drawing on that sort of fear of Palestinian immigration as a zombie metaphor. Eric, do you want to jump in?
I want to mention, kind of look at a different strand on this and ask you on it. Kind of the idea that, in difference with other horror movies, for me, the scariest movies are those that cringe on the supernatural, know that there's a not, zombies are a little bit more palatable because there's still a humanistic element to them. They're diseased humans, right? As you mentioned earlier. However, I think one of the other areas of horror that goes along with it, that's underlying a zombie attack, is the cannibalism that it presents. Yeah. And that, kind of like an inherent taboo within our psyche, that, there's a potential for humans eating humans. And for me, there's a scare set that goes along with that doesn't, doesn't equal the horror of the supernatural, the uncontrollable there, but really kind of bringing that human element of a potential for cannibalism.
Yep. I think you made two really good points there, Eric. I mean, zombies are not an example of kind of cosmic horror. They aren't the same thing like that Satan is real and he's going to sort of come and destroy the world. Zombies are often rooted in some sort of natural explanation. That it's a disease, something happened that made people zombies. They often try and give some sort of explanation that it's rooted in the physical world. It's not Cthulhu. It's a very sort of different model of horror, and maybe that's why it's not as terrifying. But yeah, cannibalism, zombies are about food and eating people. And a lot of zombie movies have food like so central to them because it's not only the zombies eating people, but it's people trying to do whatever they can to get food themselves. And there's always like that sequence in the zombie movie where they break into the supermarket after 6 months of not having anything to eat, and they all get to eat all the old Twinkies and the chips in the aisles right there. But that whole anxiety about food. And of course, where do zombies come from? Sugarcane fields. That it's been a metaphor that's about 80 or 90 years, this kind of anxiety about how do we eat? What do we eat? How do we consume? And what happens if we were to lose control of that? So it'd be a fascinating idea to really think about how food culture is a way of controlling the world around you. And how there's this anxiety behind it that if you lose control of food, what can human beings do? And how quickly would we go down that route before we started eating other people? Zombies, it's 5 minutes, right? The zombies don't even wait till they're hungry, right? They're eating other people the moment you turn into a zombie. And that image is so strong.
And starting with the brain. Yeah, it has
Yep.
to be the brain first, right?
Yeah, that's where the best nutrients are. But that wasn't even introduced by Romero. That's an idea from the 1980s. So that's from the Return of the Living Dead movie that invents the idea that you should just eat brains for zombies. And that's the one word they can say. No real reason why they want to eat the brains either. But.
Brandon?
Yeah.
I was just struck by something you just said. If you look at some of the sort of alternate history or some of the apocalyptic science fiction, S.M. Stirling, Dies the Fire, all that about the collapse of civilization. There's a lot of sort of cannibalism in that sort of genre, with the collapse of high energy civilization. And, again, in Stirling's novels like Dies of Fire, you see cannibalism appearing within weeks, especially in urban areas. And
McCarthy's The Road, another good example of cannibalism happening right away.
But it's sort of interesting because, again, if you read those books, and even some of the others, I'm thinking of a book called The Peshawar Lancers, which is another S.M. Stirling novel, sort of alternate history. It starts with a comet striking the Earth in the 1870s. But in those novels, you sort of see cannibalism going from a kind of expedient, an emergency to, in some places it becomes a religion, and in other places people evolve natural selection, and you get these sort of people who live in these kind of cannibal tribes who have become so different from ordinary humans that they will eat people, but they won't have sex with them because they smell wrong. So it seems like that's another kind of example of this fiction that comes to revolve around cannibalism and the division between what's considered human and what's not. And while it's not explicitly racial in those in Stirling's works, for example, ultimately it could be, or in some other cases it is.
Yeah.
And again, thinking back to Lovecraft and some of the sort of cannibalistic groups and some of the outre cults, in for example, Call of Cthulhu, where you see cannibalism and other sort of unmentionable things often associated with specific racial groups.
I think you're onto something there, Peter. There's often a sharp hierarchy created a lot of zombie films, novels, they're as much about the humans who survive the apocalypse as they are about the zombies. And they set up these hierarchies of these people are more human than other people. And we often see that as almost a testing ground to imagine what would different human organizational systems look like.
Right.
And a lot of these people like to imagine very negative ones.
Right. Or else, you know, people sort of thinking about what would I do?
Yeah.
You know, would I eat someone else, or, you know, so it raises all sorts of interesting questions. And again, you know, sort of going back to your original question, what do I think will happen as a result of COVID? You know, to me, it sort of depends. I mean, if people follow along the lines of, you know, some of the conservative arguments trying to say this is Chinese, you know, the Wuhan virus, or what is it, the Kung flu, or, you know, again, do you think there's the possibility of a sort of post-COVID fiction going back to some of those old, like 1910s, 20s racial tropes, you know, Sax Rohmer, you know, Fu Manchu, the Yellow Claw, all that?
Yeah, it would be, I mean, it would be unfortunate, but one could imagine sort of putting all those anxieties and creating a zombie film where you have zombies from China invading the United States or something like that. World War Z to America versus the rest of the world, or something where it expresses those, again, xenophobic, the problem. We could learn the wrong lesson from COVID, right? That we should have shut our borders, or we should be entirely closed down, and that's the only way to be safe. But one thing we haven't talked about is that a lot of the zombies are about control. Because think about the zombie rules that the survivors have to follow. You have to do these 3 things to kill the zombie, right? You have to shoot him in this part of the head. You have to avoid getting bit. If you get bit, you have to cut off your arm. It has this kind of rule-bound aspect to a lot of zombie movies. If you do these proper things, you'll survive. And that if you don't follow those rules, you'll die. So there is, like Peter was saying, almost this sense of people being in control. You get to think through, what would I do? How would I follow those rules? How would I gain control of my life? There's a big debate whether people do you feel better or worse after you watch a zombie movie? And I guess it depends on the zombie film. But for films that are so grim, usually like billions of people die in a zombie movie. It's a worldwide catastrophe, as opposed to, let's say, a slasher film where 7 or 6 people die. Like, you go to a lake and your friends get killed. In a zombie movie, like, all of society collapses. Why do we feel good about watching that story? What does it say about us? Does it allow us to be like, well, if society collapsed, I'd be the one to make it? April likes to tell me, right, if society collapses, April and I will be the first to go. We won't live the first day, right? We'll be done in the first 6 hours, right? We got no shot. I don't know how to sort of manage that stuff very well. But a lot of people like to think, well, it would allow me to have like the new tougher part of my personality come out. So that sense that, oh, I could survive the zombie apocalypse even if other people couldn't. An interesting idea. Well, any other comments we want to make?
Just, I think in what you're mentioning right now, kind of the survival strategies, etc., it's almost kind of like a wilderness attitude as well, is that those that survive, you know, could marshal their skills so as to be able to rig an arm, an apparatus out of a coat hanger, et cetera, et cetera. So it's kind of coming back to, you know, you're surviving if you have a skill set, or if you've dealt with some adversity, besides following the rules, that you have to be able to think on your feet to be able to escape the hordes.
Yeah, it's a bizarre. I think you're so right, Eric. It's a bizarre, almost like back to nature kind of thing. That you get to leave the urban city behind, and you get to go back out into the woods, and sort of, even though there are zombies out there, you're back in touch with the natural world, your survival instincts. You don't have to deal with society or rules, but it's almost this return to the primitive desire.
Right, and there are those people who sort of feel like, you know, that would be an opportunity, that the collapse of civilization, the death of most of the population on Earth would that it would be a sort of return to their fond imagining of a sort of frontier life where, and again, the idea is that we're tough, we know how to hunt and fish, we'll survive. It's all those, university professors who
are holding us down. And I could really be a warlord on a throne of skulls if society wasn't sort of suppressing my true instincts. I don't know if we have any Las Vegas or sort of New Mexico zombie films. I don't think anyone's come up here to film. That's what we need. We need a good sort of there's a great opportunity for a more sort of Chicano or Hispanic zombie tradition to come out, because since it started in Haiti, and there have been some films, Juan of the Dead's an interesting film that goes back to those islands, but certainly it is a monster that originated out of that Afro-Caribbean culture, certainly got colonized by white creators, and then there's certainly an open field that I think it could really say some powerful things about immigration, border politics, in some fascinating ways. And that might be a positive future development of zombie films. Yeah, we should sponsor something.
Well, we already have a title. We could call it Matanza. we already have that as a trademark, right?
Yeah, Matanza of the Zombies right there. So make it all about food. Or we can put some makeup on next time we do it, Eric, and we'll put a little YouTube video of sort of zombies making the traditional New Mexican, turning the wheel for the chilies and digging the pig out of the ground. That would be a fun little advertising thing. Sean's probably turning white. Be like, Brandon, we cannot make a Highland zombie promotion.
Okay, Sam's online listening, so I think he'll be able to decide on.
Yeah, not pig, but long pig,
Yep. Oh, yeah. That's what we need, some dark humor to get us ready for the debate tonight. So, well, any other comments we want to share? I am going to watch the debate, so I need to get ready by making myself a drink before that starts in 10 minutes. So hopefully it is goes more smoothly than the last one, and we can actually hear what's happening.
Well, this has been great, Brandon. I can tell that we could continue with this conversation for much, much longer. And, who knows, maybe in a couple of weeks, we'll have a whole nother twist on this. But yeah, no, this has been great. So anyhow, so does anyone have anything else to add, or no?
Well, let me thank our interpreters tonight. I know we put them through a workout, having to sign a lot of things.
And now we know. Now we know what the signing is. Yeah.
To sign cannibalism and zombies and death and all of that. So I appreciate the extra work you had to do for my talk.
Yeah, no, they're great. So, well, good.
Thank you, Brandon.
Right. Yeah, fantastic. Well, keep your doors locked. Keep the children in sight.
Yeah.
And eyes glued to the TV.
Yeah.
And everybody go play Biology Jeopardy now.
You're
wow.
running that against the debate guys? Huh?
No. Well, okay, I didn't really, yes. I planned that back in August, but it starts at 8.
Oh, at 8.
Oh.
So I can listen to an hour of the debate to get ready for the Jeopardy event.
that may be all that you want.
Yeah.
We can record it. Anyway, all right. See you guys.
Okay. All right.
Have a great evening, everyone.
Great.
Thank you so much for coming.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.